A generation ago, the idea of girl power animated many young women and their mentors who were eager to keep and expand gains made towards gender equity. It brought successes and some unintended consequences too. A new book, Smart Girls, Success, School, and the Myth of Post-Feminism takes a close look at how that's all playing out in the lives of a new generation. It's written by Shauna Pomerantz and Rebecca Raby, and we're pleased that it brings them to our studio tonight. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
What made you want to talk to elementary and high school girls at this moment in time?
Well, for the last 20 years, we've been bombarded with headlines about how successful girls are and how well they're doing today. And we've seen popular books, we've seen magazine covers, all touting girls as the new dominant gender in education. Girls are taking over the world. And so Rebecca and I were really interested to find out the story behind the story. It seems likely that there is a lot more going on than meets the eye to those headlines. And what we found is that really girls were struggling in ways that those headlines and the magazine covers and all the various hype about smart girls and failing boys erased.
I want to talk more about what's in the book, but I wanted to talk about the study first. So explain to me, how did you conduct the study, Rebecca?
First, we put up some ads, and we say in the newspaper, for example, saying that we wanted to talk to smart boys and smart girls about their experiences in high school. And then we started interviewing. We also had a research assistant do some interviewing for us, and we tried to interview everybody twice. And we interviewed some boys as well as 52 girls.
Why did you want to talk to boys if this is about girls?
Well, because we felt like boys are part of the story, right? You know, if it's about gender partly, right? We know that femininity and masculinity are interrelated, and we thought that boys play a role in shaping girls' experiences, and we also wanted to find out how things are different for boys than girls.
And Shauna, what exactly is a smart girl?
A smart girl is a girl who thinks of herself as smart. We went into this study aware that we had a particular bias towards grades, that we were definitely looking for and advertised for girls and boys who did very well or could if they tried. And so we added or could if they tried because we recognize that there's a whole bunch of ways to be smart out there that we might not be able to see just by grades alone. And so the girls and boys told us that they were smart. And when they volunteered for our study, we just assumed that they were smart kids who thought of themselves in this particular way.
And Rebecca, this was done in a small town, and you changed the name of the town. So first, why in a small town, and why change the name?
Well, it was a small town and the surrounding area, so we had, you know, some rural youth, for instance, and we thought it was really important to maintain the confidentiality of the participants, and so we changed the names of the schools and the participants themselves, and sometimes their extracurricular activities, just so, you know, they could speak to us frankly. You know, we follow at the university a certain ethics protocol, and that's part of it.
The one thing about the book that kind of stood out for me was that there was a lack of diversity. You spoke to one Black girl, right? What happened if you're trying to get a sense of what it is to be a smart girl?
This was a tough part. We tried really hard to seek diversity. You know, we put up posters in various different places, you know, cultural centers, for example. And, but, you know, you can only get who comes to talk to you. And our area that we did the study in is fairly homogeneous.
And it's in Ontario? In
Ontario, Southern Ontario. And we did try, and we also know that there's some people who might not come to the study for various reasons, right? So for instance, we know from other research that Black girls have not always had a great experience in school, and so they might feel, some of them might not have felt that they should respond to our ad, right? We don't know.
Right. You're saying that they're not empowered to feel like they're smart?
Or no, maybe, we don't know. We just can only guess, but they may have had negative experiences at school, for example. They may be less likely to trust researchers. We can only guess. We did have other kinds of diversity in terms of a number of Asian and South Asian girls participate, but certainly only the one Black girl.
And also class too, right?
Yeah, absolutely, diversity around class.
Now, for our generation, I would say the Spice Girls probably introduced us to girl power. So let's take a look at one of their videos. idea of girl power influence girls today, Shauna?
Girl power is pretty powerful, even this far away from the big fame of the Spice Girls. Girls are soaking in a culture of girl power right now. And so our study really used girl power along with the idea of post-feminism as its backdrop, where girl power was really this popular understanding that girls today can do, be, and have anything that they want, that they don't need to worry about their gender or even racial diversity because all of these things were things of the past. And so what we did is we looked at the ways that girls talked about their own understandings of power as individuals, especially in the school as smart girls, as opposed to seeing themselves as part of a collection or a collective political group. And so in this way, girls seemed very much a part of the girl power generation, even though it was 20 years ago.
And in the book, you explained that this idea of the individual stems back to a policy called neoliberalism. And it's given rise to, how has that given rise to this Supergirl, what you call the Supergirl, Rebecca?
So neoliberalism could be seen as like a political economic approach that really got going under Thatcher and Reagan and Rooney, and it's the idea that we really should treat society as individuals, and that inequalities are really either irrelevant or a thing of the past, and that the state should withdraw from sort of providing services that might equalize the playing field. And so it sort of suggests that if you work really hard, you'll be successful, and if you, and like people who are successful somehow have earned it through entirely their own initiative, and people who are not, it's through entirely their own failure.
Fault, like they're lazy or whatever, right?
Exactly. No recognition of how privilege or inequality might have a place in that. And so in that context, you know, something like the Spice Girls video is really exciting. Yes, you can do anything, you can be anything. And it fails to sort of look at how well actually not everybody has the same chance there.
And you explain too in the book that this idea of neoliberalism stems into what you call post-feminism. How does that impact young girls, Shauna?
Well, if neoliberalism is the idea that everybody is an individual and that they don't need to concern themselves with any broader structure, any power imbalance or gender inequality, racism, anything like that, then post-feminism is really just a more refined, narrow understanding of that attitude, where girls and young women typically see themselves as individuals who can rise up, who can take control. That Spice Girls clip is fantastic at exemplifying the kind of power that young women might feel that they have today as individuals: sexual power, consumer power, the power of choice, free choice. And so when we looked at how girls spoke about themselves in relation to their academic success, what we found is that they embodied this, to the most part, this idea of girl power and post-feminism, where they saw themselves as rising up on their own accord, taking a charge of their lives, not relying on anybody, not being seen as weak, always being strong, stand up, and never allowing themselves to feel that they were somehow victimized or being made to not succeed based on something that was outside of themselves.
I was just reading some of the stories of these girls. I was stressed out for them. I was like, how do you manage to do all of this stuff?
No kidding.
You know, you're awesome at school in academics. You're awesome after all the extracurricular activities. You have a part-time job. What is the downside to being a Supergirl, Rebecca?
So only some of the people we talked to were Supergirls, right? It really takes a certain package of attributes and parental support and finances to be able to be a Supergirl. And those, or even to seem to come close to it. But those ones who did seem to be able to pull it all off, as you read, you know, some of them are pretty stressed, and they have to hide this stress as well. And it took a while. Like, we were so glad we interviewed people twice, because it was often in the second interview that some of this sort of more, the harder stuff came out, you know? And part of it was a perfectionism and a feeling like they always had to sort of reach high. And the other part of that we found challenging is that it has an effect for other girls as well who can't attain that. It makes the bar really high, right? And we know from some other research that people have done that, you know, that there's this sort of feeling that that you just got to be better and then better and then better. There was actually one of the girls who actually said that, you know, I just need to constantly do better. And
study more.
You can sleep less, study more, be involved more, position yourself in a better place, and it was really destructive to some of them.
Like one of them said that you can sleep when you're dead.
Yeah.
But what happens when a Supergirl fails, or even when she thinks she's failing? Shauna?
I don't know that they were failing. I think they were succeeding on many fronts. As you mentioned, they were doing sports. They were, some of them, involved in government. They were getting straight A's. They were doing very well socially, some of them. They had partners and boyfriends and friends. But we did talk to some girls who, after 2 conversations, let down their guard just a little bit. And during that conversation, we did start to hear some stories of stress, mental health struggle, people who were absolutely concerned that they were overworked and that they were really not able to participate as fully as they wanted to in their lives.
And I also got the sense that in order to be a Supergirl, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that in order to be a Supergirl, class played a really crucial factor. And I want to ask, do Supergirls have to be white and rich?
Well, in our study, they were, well, no, they weren't all rich. They were white. We did have some who were, sort of maybe more working to middle class, but they had really, really supportive parents, and they were, I think, more the exceptions. Certainly, to have those resources made a huge difference.
Were they aware of that privilege?
Largely, no. Occasionally, somebody might say something that suggested some awareness, but generally, it was really, they reflect this individualism approach, right? Where they kind of feel like they did it on their own.
Yeah, because it kind of surprised me that they equated people who were poor as being not nice or not smart enough, which kind of surprised me. So they might be academically smart, but how do you think they see the world at large?
So these kinds of insights, like about how they talked about poorer kids, for example, they come out, you have these long conversations, and then you get these strands that take these funny little directions that I think reveal these sort of undercurrents that are troubling. And one of them certainly was around class, where, and certainly not all the girls, but some of the girls, they would say things about certain schools that had a sort of
like the ghetto kids or the ghetto schools.
Exactly. Or the rich kids' school where where the parents really care about them and that they are all smart, right? And you're thinking, so what kinds of assumptions are being made here? Really problematic assumptions.
Some girls in your study were also having a hard time balancing being popular with being smart.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we probably experienced that when we were growing up. Why is that an issue for them, and why is that an issue still?
Good question. There was definitely a tension between what we called popular femininity and academic success. And so in the book, there were a range of girls, some of whom were absolutely concerned about this tension, and they were working really hard not to be seen as smart. So some of them were dumbing down. Some of them were not putting their hands up when they knew the answer. They certainly weren't sharing their grades. And they were really concerned to contain and maintain a particular persona in the school. But then there were other girls who actually were just saying, I don't care, I'm gonna be smart, and it's who I am, and it's important to my future, and when I'm a grown-up, I'll make a great living, and you guys can all come work for me. And so I love those comments where Virginia, for example, she said, you can always go to another party, you can always flat iron your hair another day, but here we are, and we need to learn these lessons in school. And so there was a range of girls in the study who were in tension with that idea of popular femininity.
That's great insight at such a young age, I think. You mentioned popular femininity, but there's also popular masculinity. Rebecca, what is that?
Well, popular femininity, first of all, is sort of, the idea that you need to be pretty, you need to be skinny, you need to be really nice. Whereas for boys, like a sort of more popular masculinity is often associated with athletics, and also humor. We found was really important, potential key for boys to.
But not for girls.
Be popular. Not for girls. That's danger territory, right? So for both boys and girls, we argue in our book that. That for both of them, there's tension, right, between popular masculinity or femininity and being smart, and there's difficult kind of little knots there, and but you can mediate those challenges if you can kind of do, like for a girl, if she can you know, look really pretty, and if she can wear the right fashions, then she might be able to sort of get away with being smart a little bit more than another girl. And similarly, you know, for the boys, it wasn't so much that you couldn't be smart. Boys can be smart. But the boys talked about how you don't want to be seen to be trying too hard. You don't want to be seen to be studying really hard. So natural smartness is good, but worked at smartness is not so good.
Because that undermines their masculinity?
Well, this sort of, there seemed to be this need to, or like, that they kind of need to come across as sort of laissez-faire, that these things just come naturally to them.
Right.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
So, and a boy who was really good at sports, for example, or a boy who was like really funny, could maybe get away with being more studious at the same time because he was sort of cashing in on this more popular masculinity.
Well, what happens to those students who don't fit into those?
Yeah, well,
like, how are they treated?
Those were the students who had a lot more concerns in the school, and those are the students who might have been dumbing down. Some of the girls might have been very concerned to maintain their sort of quietness around their grades and not at all to be perceived as a show-off. We have a discussion in the book about teacher's pet versus class clown, for example, where the class clown was seen as this very jocular, easygoing, kind of laissez-faire character, as Rebecca described. But if a girl dared to try that, as you said, she was seen as mean. Sometimes she was seen as a teacher's pet, where she was trying to suck up to the teacher or garner grades by being a certain kind of personality. And so for some of the younger girls in our study, this was a real concern, and they spoke about how teachers' pets are almost always girls, and they're almost always disliked.
For being a teacher's pet?
For being a teacher's pet.
What happened when you asked girls if they experienced sexism? Rebecca?
Well, if we asked directly, you know, is there sexism? They would say, no, there is not sexism. Sexism happens elsewhere. Right? Sexism happens in Afghanistan.
That's really interesting.
Yes.
That they think it's somewhere else, but not here.
Yes. Now, one girl challenged that, absolutely, but various other ones really reproduced this idea that here, well, it's a very post-feminist idea, right? We're done. We're done with feminism. We've gained gender equality here, and it's not the case elsewhere.
But then they also joke that some of the boys would say, "Go make me a sandwich."
The boys
well, there were
there
were all sorts of threads. Like it was when we asked them other questions, right? You know, how do things go with sports at your school? Is that equal? You know, do girls and boys have to look differently? Who asks who out on a date? Are there jokes like this? These are the moments when these things came out. And yes, this joke about, will you know, go to the kitchen and make me a sandwich? This came up so many times, it was bizarre, right? That clearly this was a way of talking that a lot of them had bumped into in school, and they tended to try to dismiss it in a jokey way. But there are other moments in the interviews where these more serious occasions.
And you also said that you also mentioned that they didn't have the language to explain what that was.
Yeah, you know, or I mean, yes, we feel that a lot of them didn't have the language, and then there are also others who, you know, maybe know some of the language, but they were really resistant to it, right? Because you know, this idea that that feminism. Within the post-feminist climate, feminism itself could be considered a negative thing, right? So being associated with feminism was something a lot of the girls didn't want, right? They didn't want to be seen as victims, and they didn't want to be seen as I don't know, whiners maybe, right? Or angry, right? If you're supposed to be a nice girl all the time, there's not a lot of room there to talk about things like sexism.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because obviously some girls, in the book especially, we can see that they're not embracing feminism because they think that they're equal. We have a couple of photos from our website you talk about in your book, and it's called Women Against Feminism. And I'm showing you a picture right now, and the first photo says, "I don't need feminism because I am not a victim. There is no war against me. I have and will succeed in life because I work for it, not use my gender as a get out of jail free card. And I love to be sexy for my man and cook for him in the kitchen." The second photo, and this says, "I don't need feminism because I am not a victim. I take responsibility for my actions. I don't believe in lying to get what I want." Why do young women think that they're feminists, that if they're feminists, they are victims? Shauna?
I pause because it's such a complex question, and it's such an important question. To be fair, not all girls thought that. Certainly some of the girls in our study were embracing feminist politics, either in a peripheral way or in a more overt fashion, where they would say, I am a feminist, and here's why I think it's important. But for the most part, what you read in the book would have been story after story of girls saying, I don't think we need feminism anymore, and I don't think that I need to call myself a feminist. So there is this lack of language, as we suggested earlier. But this idea of neoliberalism and leading into post-feminism really valorizes the individual to such an extent where the idea of leaning on anything or anyone might be perceived as not just weakness, but a failure in your personality. And so for some reason, this became really extrapolated by the girls in the study, where they said, you know, I don't need it, I'm fine, I can handle it. Maybe this is about being strong, being girl power, being able to handle things on your own. But for the most part, we did hear girls associate feminism with that kind of weakness and needing to lean on somebody in a way that it is absolutely not. This is a misunderstanding of feminism, where feminism is seen to be a form of complaining, as these images clearly show, instead of a form of empowerment where people get together and work together to create collective change in their society.
Many headlines indicate the girls are all right, but the boys need help. What did you learn from boys about their school experience?
So, as we were saying earlier, you know, boys had some challenges too, but no. We feel that the boys had challenges, and that's had attention, and that's important. But the girls still also have challenges, and that's also important too. And we worry that this story of failing boys and successful girls has led us to start to actually not recognize that girls also face challenges. Now, in terms of boys, you know, the challenges they face, at least the ones that we talk to, you know, if you have to hide studying, well, that's a problem, right? You know, we've got girls who won't put their hand up in class, and we've got boys who feel like they can't study in order to be cool. And we know that education is really valuable. So we have boys also undermining their own futures. And then there's this other really interesting thread where, you know, these girls are working so hard, and one of the places where they talked about inequality a lot was into their future, right? That in the future, there will be inequality. We face, you know, a lack of wage parity, for instance, and they felt like the dice would be stacked against them, and so they felt that they had to work really hard in the present to be successful later on. They have to go to university. Whereas the boys, they were a lot more laid back, you know, like they didn't, for the most part, there were a few exceptions, but generally the boys certainly gave the impression of being just a bit more chill about it all, and thinking it's all going to work out, and I'm going to have employment later, and the pressures to go to university just aren't the same for them, and that could be misplaced, right? I mean, we know that, you know, like manufacturing jobs aren't available in the way that they were before, and other people have been talking about concerns about the futures of young men in work, and so their laissez-faire attitude may also be undermining them in the long run, right?
Do you worry that, considering what you saw from boys and girls from this study, that once they do get into the real world, neither will be able to function?
Function how?
In the sense of, you know, the girls believe that feminism, we don't need, like, there's no discrimination, it's all about what I do, but when they get into the real world, they might be confronted with some very real realities that they've never thought about or have been led to believe that don't exist anymore.
I think that there is an awakening probably waiting for some of the girls in the future, certainly not all. And I do think that they're going to encounter sexism in their work lives and as they progress through their educations. One of the things we know, the statistics tell the story about the lack of gender diversity in government positions, in law partnerships, as CEOs in major corporations. These statistics tell us that gender is still a salient factor in oppression out there in the world. And so we aren't in a post-feminist era, not by a long shot. And we can see this clearly in current events, in our current elected leaders. We can see all sorts of examples of sexism and the need for feminism out there in the world. So I do think they'll be confronted with some of that. And that the boys might also have to face what Rebecca was talking about earlier, just the idea that the world is not maybe as simple as they might perceive it to be, although certainly not all boys thought that either.
You did find some good things.
We did.
Totally.
What did you find encouraging about your study?
Oh, you know, there was a lot. And one of the parts that I loved was just talking to these wonderful people. They were smart. Some of them were extremely insightful. They had powerful friendships, supportive families. It was really exciting. So that was one part that was really hopeful. Another part was that some girls were really smart in how they sort of navigated, you know, this tension between being smart girls and popular femininity, and could kind of see the challenges, and we felt navigated them really well. We also felt that what school you went to did make a difference. And so there were some girls who were at certain kinds of schools that really helped them thrive, and that made us feel really positive. And there were also girls who did have insight into inequalities that exist and an interest in changing them. You know, we talked to some who overtly called themselves feminists, right?
And you also talked about micro-resistances.
Yes.
We only have a minute left.
Okay.
Shawna, can you,
Micro-resistances are resistances that happen at the everyday level that may not be noticeable to any sociologist or researcher. It's just girls plugging away day in and day out, living their lives in ways that might be different from what is considered popular femininity, or in ways that might contradict how a girl is supposed to act. So gender resistances, racial resistances, resistance to a dominant culture that suggests that girls are naturally smart and therefore we don't need to worry about them anymore. So I think girls are plugging away. We did say that being a smart girl at the very end of the book was a form of resistance in and of itself, because it's a tough subject position or a tough identity to occupy, and you have to negotiate it quite carefully.
especially in the STEM field, right?
Especially in the STEM fields.
Yeah, it would be fascinating if you could follow some of these students in university years, or just to see what happens.
Absolutely.
Shawna, Rebecca, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so
Thank you.
much.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.